The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was, Isolde would later think, a perfectly ordinary day to have everything taken from you. She had been standing at the window of her cousin's townhouse in Bath, watching the rain come down in thin sheets across the cobblestones, when the solicitor's clerk knocked at the parlor door. He was a small man with a damp collar and the particular expression of someone who has delivered bad news so many times that he has learned to make his face perfectly still while doing it. He handed her the document without preamble. The estate of Thornfield Vale, formerly held in trust for Miss Isolde Crestwood, had been transferred by deed of sale to one Dorian Aldgate, Duke of Fenwick, in settlement of debts incurred by her uncle, Mr. Clement Crestwood, acting as her guardian since the death of her father 3 years prior. She read it twice. Then she folded it along the crease the clerk had made and handed it back to him, because she did not know what else to do with it. "Is there anything to contest?" she asked. The clerk looked at the window rather than at her. "The sale was executed legally, Miss Crestwood. Your uncle held power of attorney." "My uncle held power of attorney over my person, not over the estate. The courts found otherwise." She was 23 years old. She had grown up at Thornfield Vale. She had learned to read in its library, learned to ride on its grounds, buried her father in its churchyard, and it had been sold, not to pay debts, she suspected, not really, but because her uncle had wanted the money and had found a way to get it, and no one had stopped him. "Thank you," she said, which was a strange thing to say, but she said it anyway. The clerk left. The rain continued, and Isolde stood at the window for a long time thinking about what a woman with no estate, no income, no male relative willing to act on her behalf, and no legal recourse was supposed to do. She thought about it for 3 days. She wrote 2 letters, one to her father's old solicitor, who replied with regrets, and one to a woman she'd gone to school with who had married a barrister, who replied with sympathy and an invitation to dinner that Isolde had no interest in accepting. On the 4th day, she placed an advertisement in the county paper. "Gentlewoman seeks position as housekeeper or lady's companion. References available. Experience in estate management." She had no references. She had no experience in estate management in any official capacity. But she had lived at Thornfield Vale for 23 years and had watched its household run, and she had a particular way of noticing things, and she thought that might be enough. It was the Duke of Fenwick's steward who replied first. Thornfield Vale looked different from the servants' entrance. Isolde had known that it would, in some abstract way, but knowing a thing and experiencing it are different matters entirely, and she had not anticipated the particular quality of smallness she felt standing in the kitchen yard with a traveling bag and a name she'd borrowed from a distant cousin. She had given her name as Isolde Marsh, close enough to her own name that she would answer to it without thinking, different enough, she hoped, to pass. The housekeeper who met her at the door was a woman named Mrs. Fenwick, who was somewhere in her 60s, and had the bearing of someone who had once been a great deal more severe and had mellowed only slightly with age. "Miss Marsh?" Mrs. Fenwick said, looking her over in the way that housekeepers look over new staff, which is to say thoroughly and without apology. "You're younger than I expected." "I'm told I look younger than I am," Isolde said. Mrs. Fenwick did not seem reassured. "His Grace is in residence until the end of the month. You'll stay out of his way. He doesn't like disturbances. Of course, the silver is counted every Friday. The linen is done on Mondays. The east wing is closed and you're not to go in there. Not ever. Not for any reason." Isolde thought about the east wing. She had played there as a child. Her father's study had been on the 3rd floor. "Understood," she said. She was given a room in the staff corridor, small, north-facing, with a view of the stable yard. She unpacked her bag, hung her 2 good dresses behind the door, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the particular silence of a house that doesn't know you're listening to it. Thornfield Vale sounded the same. That was the thing she hadn't expected. It creaked in the same places. The wind came through the east-facing windows with the same particular whistle she'd grown up hearing. Somewhere below, the kitchen stove was doing what it had always done in the early evening, throwing a warmth up through the floors that had never quite reached the upstairs hallways, but had always been there, if you knew where to stand. She pressed her hand flat against the wall. "I'm coming back for you," she thought. She didn't know yet what that meant or how it would work. But she thought it anyway. The Duke of Fenwick was not what she had expected. She had built him in the 3 weeks between receiving the solicitor's letter and walking through her own servant's entrance into something appropriately monstrous. A man who purchased estates the way other men purchased horses, on a whim, for sport, without thinking about what had been there before. She had imagined someone loud, someone careless, someone who moved through rooms without noticing what he disturbed. She saw him first on her 3rd morning from across the great hall. He was speaking with his steward near the front stairs, and he had his back to her, and she was carrying a basket of linens, and she almost walked directly into Mrs. Fenwick, who appeared from the side corridor without warning and put a hand on Isolde's arm. "That's His Grace," Mrs. Fenwick said very quietly, as if the Duke might hear and be disturbed by being identified. Isolde already knew. She wasn't sure how. Something about the way the steward was listening to him, with the particular attention of a man who has learned to be precise. The Duke of Fenwick turned, then, and saw them. He said nothing for a moment. His gaze moved over the staff corridor entrance, over Mrs. Fenwick, over Isolde, and then back to the steward, and he continued what he'd been saying. He had dark hair, somewhat untidy. He was taller than she'd expected. He looked, she thought, like a man who slept badly and had grown accustomed to it. She went back to work. Over the following days, she formed a more complete picture. His name was Dorian Aldgate, and he had inherited the dukedom at 26 from an uncle who had also inherited it unexpectedly, and had spent 20 years being unhappy about it. The Duke of Fenwick was now 31, and whatever he felt about the dukedom, he kept it to himself. He owned 7 properties. Thornfield Vale was the most recent acquisition, and the smallest by some margin. When Isolde asked Mrs. Fenwick carefully why he had purchased it, the housekeeper gave her a look. "His Grace doesn't explain his purchases to me, Miss Marsh." "Of course not. I only wondered if it was to be a permanent residence." "That," Mrs. Fenwick said, "is above both our stations to know." She found the problem on a Thursday. She had been methodically working her way through the household accounts, a task that had fallen to her by default when it emerged that the previous housekeeper's records were incomplete, and she had come across a set of figures that didn't align. The estate had been sold ostensibly to settle debts. Her uncle had provided a figure to the courts, but the accounts she was looking at, the actual household accounts for the year before the sale, didn't support that figure. The debts existed, but they were smaller than what her uncle had claimed. She sat very still for a long time, with the ledger open in front of her. It wasn't proof of anything, precisely. It was a discrepancy. It was the kind of discrepancy that a good solicitor might be able to explain, or that a good solicitor might be able to use, depending on which side of the matter you were on. She copied the figures onto a separate sheet of paper and tucked it into the inside of her traveling bag, behind the lining. She told herself she was being careful. She told herself she was gathering information. She told herself all of the sensible, measured things she'd been telling herself since Bath. She was also, she admitted in the privacy of her own mind, terrified, because what she was beginning to suspect was that her uncle hadn't merely taken advantage of a legal loophole. He had falsified the debt figures. And if he had falsified the debt figures, and if she could prove it, then the sale might be contestable after all. But contesting it meant exposing herself. And exposing herself meant admitting who she was. And admitting who she was in this house to this man was a thing she hadn't yet worked out how to do. She met the Duke properly, unexpectedly, in the library. She had gone in at 8:30 in the morning, which was earlier than he typically appeared in that part of the house, to replace a lamp that had been left burning and had run low. She had the lamp in one hand and a spare cylinder in the other, and she was at the back of the room near the window when she heard the door open. She turned around. He stopped in the doorway. He was in shirt sleeves, which meant he'd come from his private study rather than from the main rooms, and he eyed with a book under one arm and looking at her with the expression of a man interrupted by something he hadn't accounted for. "You're the new housekeeper," he said. "Assistant housekeeper," Isolde said. "Miss Marsh, what are you doing?" "Replacing the lamp. The one on the west table was left burning last night, and the cylinder ran low." He looked at the lamp, then back at her. "At 8:30 in the morning. Things go better when they're dealt with before they become larger problems, Your Grace." There was a pause. He came into the room, which she had not entirely expected. She'd thought he might simply note her presence and leave, and set his book down on the reading table near the window. "Were you in service before this?" he asked. She had prepared for this question. "I managed the household for my great-aunt for several years. She passed recently. And before that, I was educated at home, Your Grace." He looked at her. He had the kind of eyes that seemed to be assessing something without being able to name what it was, which Isolde found deeply inconvenient. "The household accounts," he said. She kept her expression neutral. "Yes, whoever kept them before was inconsistent. Mrs. Fenwick tells me you've been reviewing them. I have. There are some irregularities I've been working through." "What kind of irregularities?" She considered, very briefly, telling him. She thought about the piece of paper in the lining of her traveling bag, and the figures she'd copied, and what they might mean if she handed them to the right person. She thought about what it would mean to hand them to this person. "Mostly minor discrepancies in the household supply records," she said. "Nothing significant." He watched her for a moment longer than was quite comfortable. "Let me know if you find something significant," he said, and picked up his book and left. She stood very still until she heard the study door close. Then she let out a breath slowly and went back to the lamp. The man who arrived in the second week was named Silas Vellum. He came with 2 solicitors and a letter from her uncle, and he told the Duke of Fenwick's steward that he had come to examine the estate accounts on behalf of Mr. Clement Crestwood, who was apparently now claiming that the Duke had not paid the full agreed price for Thornfield Vale and was pursuing a secondary claim against the estate. Isolde heard about this from the kitchen maid, who had heard it from the footman, who had been in the entrance hall when Vellum arrived. She went to find Mrs. Fenwick. "Do you know what this is about?" she asked, as carefully as she could. Mrs. Fenwick looked at her over her spectacles. "It's a legal matter, Miss Marsh. Nothing to do with us. Will they want access to the household accounts? I expect Mr. Vellum will want access to whatever he can get his hands on." That night, Isolde sat in her north-facing room with the piece of paper from the lining of her bag and thought about Silas Vellum. She had never met him, but she knew his name. He had been her uncle's solicitor for 12 years. He had been in the room, she had been told, when the power of attorney was signed. He was not, she was nearly certain, a man who had arrived to investigate anything. He was a man who had arrived to make sure certain things stayed buried, and the household accounts she had been reviewing were very shortly going to be exactly what he was looking for. She had 2 choices. She could take what she had to the Duke, Or she could do nothing and wait to see if Vellum found anything before she could act. She had never been good at doing nothing. She knocked on the door of the Duke's private study at 7 o'clock the following morning. There was a long pause. Then, "Come in." He was at his desk. He looked like he had been there for some time, which confirmed her suspicion about the sleeping. He looked at her without surprise, which suggested he was either very composed or very tired, and she suspected both. "Miss Marsh, Your Grace." She stepped inside and closed the door. "I need to speak with you about the household accounts." Something shifted in his expression. Not alarm exactly, something more attentive. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I told you they contained minor discrepancies," she said. "That was not entirely accurate." She placed the paper on his desk. He looked at it, then at her, and then he picked it up. She watched him, read it. She watched the point at which he understood what he was looking at. "These are the figures submitted to the court," he said slowly. "Yes, and these are the actual household accounts for the same period." "Yes." The debt was inflated. He set the paper down. He was looking at her now with an expression she couldn't read. "By roughly a third, yes. How did you find this?" "I reviewed the accounts thoroughly." "Why?" There it was. The question she had known was coming since the moment she walked through the servant's entrance. She had thought about how to answer it. She had written several versions in her head. She had rehearsed the cautious version, the partial version, the version that gave him enough to work with, without giving him everything. But she was tired. She had been at Thornfield Vale for 2 weeks, and she had stood in her father's house every day of those 2 weeks, and pretended not to know the name of the painting in the upstairs corridor, or why the window in the blue parlor had never quite closed properly, and she was tired of pretending. "Because it's my house," she said. The silence that followed was very complete. "I beg your pardon," he said. "My name is Isolde Crestwood. Clement Crestwood is my uncle. He held power of attorney over my guardian estate after my father's death, and he used it to sell Thornfield Vale, my inheritance, in order to access capital he needed for his own debts. The figures he presented to the court were falsified. I believe I can prove it. And I believe the man he sent here, Silas Vellum, has come to ensure that proof does not surface." She watched him. She had no way of knowing what he would do. She had no way of knowing, she realized, whether he was a man who would call for Mrs. Fenwick and have her removed, or a man who would listen. He looked at the paper on his desk for a long moment. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I found the discrepancy 8 days ago. And before that, how long have you been in this house?" 13 days. You came here under a false name, yes, to look for this, to look for anything. I didn't know what I'd find." He was quiet again. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of horses in the stable yard, and the ordinary sounds of the household beginning its day, and she thought, briefly, that she had now done what she came to do, and it was possible everything was about to become significantly worse. "Vellum," the Duke said. "He's here on your uncle's behalf." "Yes, to bury the evidence. That's my belief, and if he does, the discrepancy disappears. Your Grace purchased a property at full legal price. The debt figure stands as recorded, and my uncle faces no consequences, and I have no grounds on which to contest the sale." She paused. "And Thornfield Vale remains yours." He looked at her directly then. He had been mostly looking at the paper, or at the desk, or at the middle distance. The way some people look when they're thinking, rather than when they're present. Now he was looking at her, and she found it harder to maintain her composure than she had expected. "You could have gone to a solicitor," he said. "I did. My father's old firm sent their regrets. You could have gone to the courts directly." "With what?" "The word of a woman with no standing and no documented evidence against a guardian who held legal authority over the estate." Instead, you walked into my house under a false name and spent 2 weeks looking through my accounts. Yes, that was either very bold or very stupid. Possibly both, she said. Something crossed his face then. She thought for a moment that it might have been the beginning of a smile, but it was brief enough that she couldn't be certain. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. She had not expected that question. She had expected anger or dismissal or demands. She had not expected to be asked, "I want you to delay Vellum's access to the accounts until I can get the original probate records from the court. 3 days, perhaps 4. I have a contact who can retrieve them quickly if I write today." She kept her voice steady. "If the records confirm the discrepancy, there are grounds to challenge the transaction. The estate could be returned. To you." "Yes." "Which would mean," he said very evenly, "that I lose the property I paid for." She had thought about this too, many times. "You would be entitled to full restitution from my uncle," she said. "Your purchase price, returned from assets he does not in fact need, because his debts are a third smaller than he claimed. Your solicitor could pursue that claim." She paused. "I know that's not the same as the property." He looked at her for a long time. "It isn't," he agreed. "I know. You're asking me to take a loss on the chance that you're right about the figures and that the courts will rule in your favor in a case where your guardian held documented legal authority and you are a woman with no standing and no male representative." When he put it that way, she thought it did sound somewhat hopeless. "Yes," she said. "Why would I do that?" It was a fair question. It was the fairest question anyone had asked her in a very long time. She thought about all the answers she might give. The moral argument, the legal strategy, the practical points about Vellum, and what his presence indicated about her uncle's vulnerability. "Because you purchased a property that was not legally for sale," she said finally, "and because you knew that, or suspected it, or you wouldn't have looked at the accounts the way you did when I mentioned them. And because, whatever you are, Your Grace, I don't think you are the kind of man who is comfortable profiting from a fraud he could have stopped." The silence this time was different. She couldn't say how, exactly. But it was. "Write your letter," he said. "I'll have Vellum told the accounts are currently under internal review and not available for external examination. That buys you 4 days. After that, whatever you have, you bring it here, and we'll see what can be done." She stood. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said, picking up his pen. "I haven't agreed to anything yet." The records arrived in 3 days, not 4. They arrived in a packet addressed to her cousin in Bath, who forwarded them to a name Isolde had established at the local post office, and she walked into the village on a gray Wednesday morning and collected them herself. She sat in the parlor of a tea room and read through them 3 times, and by the time she finished her tea, she was shaking, not with fear, as she'd half expected, but with something that felt, inconveniently and uncomplicatedly, like relief. The original probate filing showed the estate's debt at the figure the household accounts supported. The inflated figure had been added in a supplementary filing, and that supplementary filing had been submitted by Silas Vellum's firm. It wasn't just her uncle, it was Vellum. And Vellum's submission was dated 3 weeks after the original probate, which meant there was a paper trail, and the paper trail was dated. And dated documents are the kind of thing that courts take seriously. She walked back to Thornfield Vale in the thin autumn rain and felt the ground under her feet and thought about her father, who had walked this same lane every morning of his adult life, and who had died believing she would do the same. She knocked on the Duke's study door at 4 o'clock. He read the documents in silence. She watched him turn the pages. She watched him go back and reread the supplementary filing. She watched the moment he understood. "Vellum submitted this," he said. "Yes, not your uncle directly. The filing is from Vellum's firm, but my uncle would have instructed it." He set the papers down. He was quiet for a moment in the way she had come to associate with him actually thinking, rather than performing thought. "This is enough to challenge the transaction," he said. "It should be. Depending on the court, it's enough," he said. He didn't say it like a question. He said it like a man who has looked at a thing and determined its weight. "Your Grace." She stopped. She had rehearsed this part too, and now that she was here, it felt thin. "You stand to lose the property. I want to be clear that I understand that and that I—" "Miss Crestwood." She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not the careful blankness of their earlier conversations. Not the assessing look she'd seen in the library. Something more direct. "I purchased this estate," he said, "because my father visited it once when I was 8 years old, and he told me it was the finest property in the north of England. He died the following year. I had no particular plan for it. I didn't need another property." He paused. "I think I bought it because I wanted to see if he was right." She didn't know what to say to that. "Was he?" she asked, finally. The Duke looked at the window, at the view of the grounds in the gray October light. "Yes," he said. "He was." There was a long quiet. "I'll have my solicitor contact the court," he said. "You'll need to be prepared to file formally within the week. I'll provide a statement confirming the discrepancy was discovered during my own review of the accounts. You don't need to be named until necessary. That gives you some time to arrange representation." She stared at him. "You're helping me," she said. She hadn't meant to say it like that, like she was still surprised. "I'm rectifying a fraud I inadvertently participated in," he said. "That's not the same thing." But he said it without quite looking at her, which she thought meant it wasn't entirely true. The case took 4 months. Silas Vellum denied everything, initially, and then his junior clerk provided testimony that was rather more useful, and her uncle's secondary creditors surfaced with documents that were more useful still, and by February of the following year, a court in London had determined that the supplementary probate filing had been fraudulent and that the original transaction was therefore voidable. Thornfield Vale was returned to Isolde Crestwood in her own name on a Thursday in late February, with a deed that named her as the sole legal holder, with no guardian and no trustee. She stood in the entrance hall the afternoon the papers were delivered and looked at the staircase and the tall windows and the morning light coming through the glass, and she pressed her hand flat against the wall the way she had on her first night in the servants' corridor. And she did not cry, which she had promised herself she wouldn't. She was alone in the house. She had let the staff take the afternoon at liberty. She walked through every room. She went to the library. She went to the blue parlor with the window that didn't close properly. She went to the east wing, which she had avoided, and opened the door to her father's study, and stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she sat down at his desk and wrote a letter. She had written to the Duke of Fenwick twice during the 4 months, briefly, to keep him informed of developments. He had written back, also briefly, to confirm that his own solicitor had recovered the purchase price from her uncle's assets. There had been nothing in those letters beyond what was practical. She had been careful about that. She had been careful about quite a lot of things. She wrote the letter slowly, and she revised it twice, and then she folded it and sealed it before she could revise it a third time. The letter said, among other things, "You told me once that you came to Thornfield Vale because your father said it was the finest property in the north of England, and you wanted to see if he was right. I have thought about that more than I perhaps should have. If you would like to see it properly, in spring, when it's at its best, I believe I owe you that, at the very least." She did not write what she actually meant, which was that she had thought about him considerably more than was practical or sensible, and that she was beginning to suspect this would continue regardless of what she did about it, and that she would rather know what he thought about that than continue not knowing. She sent the letter. He arrived 6 weeks later, at the beginning of April, when the grounds were doing exactly what she had promised they would do. She met him at the front entrance, which was different from the servants' entrance, and which she had noted, privately, with some satisfaction. He looked at the house. He looked at the grounds. He looked at her. "Your father was right," she said. "He usually was," said the Duke of Fenwick. Then, after a moment, more quietly, "I'm glad it's yours again." She had thought when she imagined this moment, and she had imagined it more than once, that she would feel the complete resolution of something, the closing of a circle, the restoration of what had been taken. What she felt, standing in the April light with the grounds of Thornfield Vale behind her, and this man looking at her as though she were something he'd been thinking about for 6 weeks, was not the end of anything. It was, she thought, with the peculiar clarity that comes just before you stop being careful, something entirely new.